when we're dealing with a flat image, or a multiplanar image as I would call it, that is layers in the image under conditions of movement, we're dealing with a tradition of art that actually has a kind of technological grasp on the world. So for Murakami, for instance, he keeps developing this contrast between what a multiplanar image does versus Cartesian perspective, right? Cartesian perspective creates these closed worlds and implies subjective mastery and a certain kind of scientific control, whereas Superflat, as he acknowledges, has a different relation to technology, but it's not non-technological. And that's what interested me. So in a purely opportunistic way almost, I built on Murakami in order to suggest that we can think of a different kind of lineage of the technologization of the image that wouldn't be based on the Cartesian tradition, but would be based on exploded projection. That is, the way in which you can array objects in space and layers in order to work with them like an assembly diagram. Unlike Miyazaki Hayao, Anno Hideaki takes the notion of animatism not to be so much a form of resistance to a technological world, but as the realization of a new kind of technological world. And Anno Hideaki's a little bit ambivalent. Like sometimes he plays with this new technological world as if it's a dystopia. And sometimes he plays with it as if it's a new kind of utopia. So he's always a bit ambivalent. But nonetheless, I think his animated TV series are really brilliant for exploring this question about how you can transform the human into assembly diagram, like literally human beings are engineered by deities that come down to Earth or aliens or some such, but that experience becomes livable in a certain way through the technological grasp it allows in the construction of new kinds of artificial worlds, and basically new modes of communication. Part of the interest of Nadia is literally it's a script Miyazaki wrote himself, and it's a script he wrote that's almost identical to his Castle in the Sky movie. And, you know, Anno at the time was very aware of this, and so he picked up this Miyazaki script and he does the most kind of non-Miyazaki thing possible with it, right? Which is to have just these incredibly long sequences of limited animation where nothing seems to be moving forward, right? So he's constantly undermining all of the forward movement that the Miyazaki script implies. You know, for someone like Miyazaki, who I feel is very Heideggerian, he's doing something similar to Heidegger in that he's always trying to hold a certain kind of technology under erasure. He's like, it's as if it's there, but it cannot be there, right? He's constantly playing, for instance, his opposition to cinematic movement or this form of cinematism. It's as if you can never get rid of it, but you're kind of holding it under erasure by doing something else. So that's the new relation to technology. So for Miyazaki, animatism becomes this different kind of worldview, different way of doing things, but at the same time it's always posed against this other form of movement. But when you get to Anno, suddenly he doesn't even care about that other kind of movement at all. He doesn't need to hold anything under erasure. He just picks up animatism and runs with it. And so what's interesting to me about this, and I think this is where we open up animation into its media mix, into video games and all these other forms, is now you see a form that really doesn't need to oppose another form, but has a certain kind of autonomy, and yet has a different technological lineage. So for instance, if we think about what it means in terms of screens, Anno will connect, say, the screen all the way back to these orthogonic perspective problems, right? Like the assembly diagram. That's how he thinks visually. So images are always something you can touch, enter into, but it's not a world in the sense of being enclosed in a world. It's a world you can just take apart and put back together in different ways. In effect, what it is, it's non-Cartesian without even wanting a relation to Cartesianism. And, I mean, well, there's two ways to put it that I think are interesting. One that will tell you, for instance, if you want to understand video games and how they work on screens, you have to go back to the Renaissance. But given that most of these video games and their aesthetics are Japanese, why wouldn't you go back to the Edo period and just avoid Cartesian perspective? And I think this is more of what I see going on with Anno's work. He's not interested in that connection to a Cartesian tradition or resisting it, because he's already found something that has a different kind of technological grasp on the world. And so he can create animations like exploded diagrams where you can re-watch the animation from the perspective of different characters, but also if you're a fan, you can remake it from different standpoints. Or even Anno himself. I mean, he remade the TV series as a movie, and then he's remade it again as a series of 4 digital movies. So it creates a form that really doesn't cohere in the way a Cartesian form might, but nonetheless allows for this constant technological intervention in image space. Writing a book like this, I did not want to end up with a binary structure of Miyazaki versus Anno, or full animation versus limited animation, because one of the points of the book was to say, okay, there's different lineages in Japan, and they need to be looked at as lineages, not just as one giant anime thing, but for a different lineage of working through the aesthetics and the technical implications of images. I turned to Chobitsu partly because, again, you have a story that is in dialogue with Nadia as well as with Miyazaki, but it's really scandalous, right? I mean, she has this on-off switch between her legs that is precisely the jewel of Nadia, or the jewel of Ashita and Castle in the Sky. And the Clamp team, they're very astute. They do this really deliberately. They want to make us think about, okay, we're going to have a similar kind of story, but we're really going to foreground these kinds of strange sexual, technological implications of male-female relations. For me, it was actually a challenge, and I think it was part of the hardest to write, because I didn't want to say you have these two things and then you have a third thing that's beyond all of them, but really think about the way in which these 3 different lineages were speaking to one another, creating kind of a dialogue. For Anno, for instance, you already see in Nadia and Evangelion the sense that his way of using animatism results in little tiny worlds. Every character is kind of lost in their own self-formation. They're trying to create themselves through these minimalized technologies around them. But it's still very much in a heroic narrative, even if it's holding it a little bit aside. I mean, you still have very classic male and female character. And when you get to Chobitsu, suddenly the gendering of this technology is so obvious that it forces you to rethink the project. And in a sense, what it does is bring you very much into questions of how is anime going to do psychology. The Lacanian thing became sort of for me, a point of departure, a way of thinking of what's going on, because, Lacanian psychoanalysis has a certain hold in the academy, but it's also very complex because it's trying to deal with the way in which subjects form themselves through some kind of constitutive lack that they displace, that then gets kind of amplified into a position in the world. And it seemed to me that in Chobitsu, it begins with something like that. It almost feels like it could be a classic Lacanian narrative. That is, you have a male hero who experiences a certain kind of symptomatic lack, and he amplifies that, and he's able to deal with his symptoms by acquiring this girl computer, right, which somehow solves some kind of problem for him. But then when you look at it on the other hand, it would seem that the computer be called in Lacanian terms hystericized, right? That she doesn't really have material consistency. But that's where the Lacanian scenario breaks down, because suddenly this girl computer is not just behaving in a hysterical manner. She's introducing something very different psychologically. And what was interesting to me about this is you start to get out of depth psychology, right? So you have a kind of computerized psychology, this entity that actually has feelings, is operative in the world, but it's never based on some kind of constitutive lack. It's not like they're missing something. So the way in which desire functions is much more radical and kind of crazy in a way. It's something that the Clamp team does well because of the lineage they came out of. They came out of Komiketo. They were producing boys' love parody manga based on things like Captain Tsubasa and Sanseiya. So, in a way, really good at doing something that I do feel a lot of other manga artists and animators are doing, but they have a certain kind of mastery of this skill. And I mean, I would argue that Madoka Magica may be the next step after Chobits. It does for the magical girl genre what Evangelion does, or for the girl robot genre what Chobits does. So I think this is a general theme in anime, and it's still operative now. In manga, say if you read something like Real Account, which is kind of a social media manga where people are trapped in social media, it's sort of a trope almost now that you're moving in these spaces that feel most beautiful when, say, you're sliding over surfaces, whether it's flying or swimming, right? And this affords a certain kind of heightened aesthetic appeal. But there's always this uncanny moment where it feels like a moment of depth emerges. But when the depth emerges, it doesn't become a psychological depth that explains the characters. What it does is it opens up another world or another dimension. And you can either read the story from a different angle or rewrite it from a different perspective, or actually just literally go in another direction. That was kind of interesting me in Chobits. It's the same thing. Like when you get these moments where it feels like depth will happen, they don't operate as a truth. They operate as a shifter to allow you to transform your relation to the story.